Welcome to our fourth Lives in Law and Policy series. I am joined today by State Senator Eric Lesser. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Dan.
And we are going to start, as always, to have you tell us a little bit about your journey to your current position. I know it started in Longmeadow and has ended up in Longmeadow.
Anyone from Western Mass here?
Has anyone heard of Western Mass? No, and it's not Newton, okay?
Oh, you're from Andover.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
That's north.
It's like,
yeah.
but I know our Longmeadow. So,
All right,
yeah.
perfect.
Because some people would say Framingham is Western Mass. I mean, it depends on the crowd. It depends on the crowd. So, okay. So, so anyway, Eric, I will let Eric describe his own background. I sent a few of you articles about it, but Eric has had a really fascinating journey from Longmeadow to the long shot presidential campaign from a U.S. Senator named Barack Obama to working in the West Wing and then going to law school and ultimately returning to where he grew up and now representing the very community and greater area that he grew up. So in some ways that puts you a little bit off the beaten path, which we can discuss.
Yeah.
And then the other goal here, and I really hope people will ask questions, because Eric has had quite a wide range of experiences, and I also think because you're pretty close to your student days,
Yeah.
that
I'm not that old.
right,
That's what he's saying. Yeah.
yeah, young, full of enthusiasm, right? So no, just that you can offer some thoughts because you were in this position not too long ago. So I guess maybe you can start just about your upbringing and what got you interested in politics, and then your first experiences in politics, and then I know you have some fun and interesting stories.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Dan. I really appreciate it. And Dan's a great friend and a good guy to learn from. So you should all really consider yourselves lucky because he's been around the block too and has a lot of good insights and thoughts on public policy issues. So always try to, as much as I can, find excuses to get together and to do things like this because it's a lot of fun. I thought, as Dan mentioned, what I would do is give you guys a little bit of a sense of my path over the last few years, and then just happy to take questions, on whatever topics people have. People want to ask about current legislation we have going on, happy to talk about that. If you want to ask about
2016.
Yeah, 26 kibitz about 2016 race, happy to do that, or questions about work or life in Washington or in the White House or that kind of stuff. So the story really begins for me, as Dan mentioned, where I grew up in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, which is about 90 miles from here. Straight down the Mass Pike in Western Massachusetts, which is not Boston. It's its own place. Very few people in Western Massachusetts work in Boston. We come here for Red Sox games or to hang out or go to Faneuil Hall or something. But it's a separate place. And I grew up in a town about 16,000 people. And actually, the first foray I ever had really into politics was when I was a little younger than you guys. I was 16 years old. I was a junior at Longmeadow High School, and there were a round of budget cuts announced. 40 teachers in my high school were going to be laid off, and this wasn't a big school. So it was going to basically mean the end of the art program, end of the music program. They were going to basically cut back the school sports to almost nothing. They were going to cut back a lot of the educational programs and have to expand the class sizes quite a lot. And it was because of budget decisions that had been made in Boston. And I frankly didn't think it was fair that 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds should have to pay the price for bad decisions made 90 miles away. So what did we do? We organized, put a coalition together of parents, teachers, and students. We knocked on every door in our town. There are 5,700 doors in Longmeadow. We knocked on every single one, asking for a budget override to pay for the gap, the funding gap that was going to cause those layoffs. And importantly,
And you have to be approved by the voters.
exactly. Yeah. So the way this works is towns in Massachusetts can do something called Proposition 2.5 override, which is basically the town voting itself to increase their property taxes to fund services, and it's a hard vote. Most people don't like to pay for increased taxes. So it was an early political lesson, and in fact, the vote lost overwhelmingly. It wasn't even close, by almost 2-1. We lost that first vote, and it was an early lesson for me because despite the fact that we were very enthusiastic and knocked on every door and thought we had a great argument, a very large portion of our community didn't agree, and we lost. So, but I was, young. I didn't really know any better. So I didn't take no for an answer. We just put the measure actually literally right back up on the ballot and knocked on every single door again. And that was another early lesson in politics because we didn't change much. We just did it again and knocked on every door again. And the second vote passed. It actually narrowly passed. Part of it was because the pink slips had been issued in that interim period to the teachers, and it got real to people because they saw what was going to actually happen if the funding didn't come.
So they felt the effects.
Exactly, and you've probably studied this in your classes, but there's a big difference between abstract costs and concrete costs, and nobody, of course, it's a lot harder to motivate action, unfortunately, until costs become real for people. That was an early lesson for me in that. And we succeeded in getting it passed, and they literally ripped up the pink slips, threw them in the garbage. Those 40 teacher jobs were saved. So it was really an early lesson for me that, people who care about their community can actually change it, and that the political process can be a path for making meaningful change, making a difference. So I caught the bug. I came to Boston for college. I went to Harvard for my undergrad, and it was there that I got wrapped up with the campaign of this skinny guy with a funny name from Illinois called Barack Obama. And at the time, this is before he had the Secret Service entourage and the plane and everything else.
So he announced in February of '07.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And
so
his book came out. He had a nice book tour, and then decided, I think, in December of '06, right?
Yeah, so it was like the midterm elections that happened in November of 2006. Deval Patrick, who was, of course, the immediate previous governor before Charlie Baker, that was when he was on the ballot. Mm-hmm. He had a big history-making election then in 2006 that I was involved in when I was a student, and it was basically right after that election that the talk began in earnest. Mm-hmm. I started driving up to New Hampshire because he was taking exploratory visits to sort of meet people in New Hampshire.
When current politicians start hanging out in Iowa or New Hampshire, it's generally not for the corn or the skiing, right? So
it's hard syrup.
Right. No, but it's hard to hide that because you have to book reservations, and right, so you always hear that. But this is actually, I think, a moment, and I've said this before, the proximity, the fact that they're in Boston. You took advantage of that.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Which is going up there.
So basically what I did was I would just drive up to New Hampshire and volunteer. Actually, in the beginning, Obama didn't even have an office. We would find people on meetup.com, which was like an early Facebook, and was not sketchy then. It was like more mainstream. And we would basically all meet up at like a local restaurant or a bar or something, and for the first hour, we'd all be scheming. Okay, you call this guy. I'll write a letter to the editor. You talk to this person, and then after an hour or so, after a round of drinks, everyone was just would just start hanging out. But that was its own lesson because in order to have effective campaigns, in order to have effective organizing, you need a common sense of mission, and you do need to be friends with the people around you because you've got to work as a cohesive whole. And a lot of the people I worked with in those early days are now, one went on to become a cabinet secretary, another one, they all kind of went on to have senior roles in the administration, and actually several are now elected officials in other parts of the country. So to make a long story short, as Dan was saying, my job kind of morphed into being into basically picking Obama up from the airport when he arrived in New Hampshire. My title was Deputy Director of Advance, which is sort of a mouthful. Basically what that was I was like the kid that was in charge of getting him from place to place in the state.
But you had something valuable that others didn't, which was a lot of time with the candidate. I mean,
right.
So right. The one commodity that you can't create more of is time. So you were getting And also, you were
Dan,
helping him out.
Exactly. Dan's point is right on, because what basically my job was is I would go to the Avis rent-a-car facility at the Manchester airport, pick him up off a Southwest flight from DC or Chicago, and we would go to like 3 or 4 different events. And if there were this many people in the room, that was actually a fine event. It wasn't like anyone was bent out of shape that there weren't enough people.
And just to capture, we're in early '07.
This is like June, July of 2007.
Yeah.
So
amazing.
And then I would bring him back to the airport. He would usually come in on the first flight, go back on the last flight, and then as it grew, it was a little bit like being part of a tech startup or something, because then he started coming with a couple staff members, and then as we got closer to the primary, he started coming in a plane, like a little plane, because the schedule, the commercial air schedules just didn't work anymore. And then to kind of speed it up a little bit, when the New Hampshire primary was over, that's really when you move to a national election. I mean, until then, you're really, the good campaigns, and we can talk about this in relation to the current candidates.
Right.
But the good candidates and the ones who are probably ultimately going to be the nominees are spending their time and their infrastructure in the early states, Iowa and New Hampshire, South Carolina and Nevada. But after the New Hampshire primary, that's really when you explode into a national campaign, because the next big contest is the Super Tuesday contest, which is 22 states all at once. And so what you do is you literally rent a plane, a Boeing 737 in our case, and they paint their name on the side. You've probably seen it on the news. And you start traveling with about 30, 40 reporters who, because they can't really keep up unless they go on the plane with you, and about 8, 9 staff members. So my job at that point, I got recruited to basically be it was sort of like being the mom on the family vacation. I was in charge of keeping track of all the luggage, making sure that nothing was getting lost. And it was like being the equipment. I kind of describe it as being the equipment manager for the 2004 Red Sox. You're just sort of along for the ride, watching what was happening. And we ended up traveling to 47 states. So I traveled to 47 states with then candidate Obama. We traveled over 200,000 miles, and did that from basically the end of the New Hampshire primary, which was in January of 2008, until Election Day in November of 2008.
And for those who don't remember, this was a historic election on maybe 7 or 8 accounts, but one of them was how long the Democratic primary went on, right? So your first goal as a candidate is to make it out of Iowa, then make it out of New Hampshire and sort of survive. But ultimately, after John Edwards withdrew, it became the Obama-Clinton contest, and it just kept going. And the one point that you made earlier about the camaraderie, that was certainly a virtue for Team Obama, no drama Obama, and I think that actually contributed to the loss for the Clinton team.
Right.
In that their collegiality, by all accounts, was not at the level that the Obama team was.
Yeah, I mean, they really put an emphasis on that, and some of that was the president's own background, because he was an organizer, a community organizer himself, and he kind of understood the value of having giving young, idealistic people with a lot of energy space to, make the most of that energy, and that was really their sort of model that 2008 campaign ran off of. But yeah, I mean, there were just so many funny stories. My claim to fame after 47 states and 200,000 miles is that I never once lost a bag, because I was in charge of keeping track of all the luggage. So then when I fast forward a few years later, when I was campaigning, my line I used to use at the VFW halls and in the retirement communities was, after 200,000 miles in 47 states, I never once lost a bag, so nobody can say Eric Wester doesn't deliver.
It worked.
Always got to laugh, yeah. There were just all kinds of crazy circumstances. At one point, I had to chase a very prominent and very famous reporter's underwear across a tarmac.
Didn't know that the suitcase?
Yeah, because her suitcase exploded, and basically in front of 40 reporters who were all recording it and taking pictures. I had to run across a windswept tarmac to go get it and bring it back.
But also the first real social media campaign, right? So in 2004, John Kerry did something historic right here in Boston. He said during his acceptance speech, go to www.johnkerry.com. That had never been done before. But '08 may have really been the first kind of internet election, and Obama used that to his advantage.
Yeah, we were all on Facebook, and Twitter wasn't really around yet, and Instagram wasn't around yet, but Facebook certainly was, and that was a big organizing tool for us. And in fact, the person who led our digital organizing for Barack Obama was a friend of mine from college, actually, Chris Hughes, who was one of the co-founders of Facebook. People probably recognize him from The Social Network, from that movie. So Chris was actually full-time in our headquarters in Chicago running the president, now he wasn't the president then, but running Senator Obama's digital strategy. And it was pretty good as a result. Yeah, we were.
Yeah, there was just an article, I'm jumping ahead a little bit and then we'll come back to the victory in your job, but there was just an article of, I don't know if anyone saw this in the New York Times, but Obama on Twitter, that there's actually a team that is working on Obama's Twitter account. So they try to capture his voice, but it's actually like 20 people.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was so disappointed. I thought he was there, typing it in. He doesn't have time, right, to...
Well, he'll kind of verbally say, "Hey, tweet this out." I mean, he gets more than I think previous presidents have. I mean, he gets what he gets this stuff. He has a Mac. He uses it on the '08 campaign. He used to listen to his iPod all the time, and he used email. I mean, he was like a normal person, until I guess you become president, and then it becomes a little harder. But
the bubble, right?
Right. But he was, he was, totally agile with that, and and his staff and his team would interact with him by with text and would use email and everything else. So and he understood it, and he used it. So he wins. Yeah.
I don't mean to ruin the ending.
No. But
he won.
So after he won, I had gotten to know his kind of senior advisor and political counsel is this guy by the name of David Axelrod, who traveled quite a lot with us, and got to know him just because, like Dan was mentioning, the camaraderie of you're in hotels together, you're in vans together, you're on airplanes together, you're literally, it's like a family vacation kind of times a million.
Yeah.
So David asked me to basically join him as his kind of special assistant, and it's sort of a role that's unique in politics, I think. I mean, I think maybe academia certainly doesn't have jobs like this, but corporate world does a little bit. I've never really seen equivalent roles, but it's a kind of jack of all trades. I mean, I was in charge of his schedule and the administrative functions and sort of the logistical things, but also as the sort of traffic cop and sort of air traffic control officer for him in his office. And I had a little cubby hole next to his office, which was directly adjacent to the Oval Office. And I was 40 feet from the front door of the Oval Office, and I was one of the first Obama staff members to walk into the West Wing on Inauguration Day.
Wow.
I remember it vividly. Right after he took the oath of office, noon on January 20th, 2009, we got ushered onto a bus and driven down Pennsylvania Avenue, because that was the only clear road, which was the parade route, and drove about 15 of us who were like basically the kids, because we had to get everything ready for our bosses, so we had to go first. So they drove us ahead, brought us through the front gate. They handed me a badge, handed me a BlackBerry. A very, very polite woman from the Bush administration handed me a badge and handed me a BlackBerry, and then literally disappeared.
This is the beauty of American democracy.
Yeah.
the peaceful transition, and then good luck.
Yeah,
right.
no, I mean, and actually to their credit, we went a couple times before when Bush was still president to sort of, to get tours and to get set up, and they were they couldn't have been more lovely or more gracious, but at noon on January 20th, they weren't sticking around, and we didn't want them sticking around.
Work there anymore,
so they left, and I remember I walked into the office where Axelrod's office was going to be, in the little cubby where I was going to be, and I walked in, and we were in the West Wing. I mean, it's and the phone was ringing. I didn't even know what the phone number was. And I remember the phone was ringing, and I was like sort of timid. I was like, oh, like, do I pick it up? Or and my first instinct and my first thought was, oh my God, how did my mom get the phone number?
Yeah, she wanted to remind you. Like,
yeah. I was like, oh no, she found the
laundry.
Yeah, but I picked it up, and it was George Stephanopoulos.
Cool.
Yeah. Who was trying to find my boss, and I kind of asked him sheepishly. I was like, he's not here. He's like still at the parade. You could hear the parade going on outside. I said, just out of curiosity, what's the phone number? And he goes, he's like, I'm not exactly sure what the phone number is, but I called the White House switchboard because he used to work there. He worked for President Clinton. So he knew all these these ins and outs. So he said, I called the White House switchboard and asked to be connected to David Axelrod's office, and I said, oh, okay. He goes, here's the switchboard number. He goes, my advice is I call this switchboard number and ask them what your phone number is.
Great.
So I was like, okay, so sounds good. And then we were off and running. I was there during the response to the Great Recession, during the response to the financial crisis. I was there, worked with Elizabeth Warren on the passage of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform. Was there for the entire process of healthcare reform, passage of healthcare reform.
The beer summit.
Yeah, the more mundane things like the beer summit.
So I don't know if people remember this, but maybe this will ring a bell. In 2009, Henry Louis Gates, a Harvard professor, got arrested at his own house in Cambridge. Does this ring a bell for anyone? And it became a presidential issue. Obama referred to it during a press conference, and then there had to be this beer summit, and you can talk about how local the politics get.
Yeah,
so you'll love this. The calls start coming in.
Well, we started getting calls from all these members of Congress asking for their district's beers to be used in the beer summit.
Right?
And somehow,
because the media is going to mention, I don't know, again, look this up. The media talked about what each of them drank, so talk about great publicity. So they start getting lobbied.
So and somehow this ended up on my plate. I guess things rolled downhill. But so I started fielding all these calls from members of Congress asking for their local district's beer to be used in the beer summit. But you got to take that stuff seriously, especially because we're in the middle of a huge legislative fight on the Affordable Care Act and getting healthcare reform through. And the last thing you need is a member of Congress holding that up because their local district's beer got slighted. And as ridiculous as that sounds, that can happen. So you have to take it seriously. But it was really a great experience. But I was eager to get some more some more exposure to kind of policy work. So after about 2 years of doing that, I went to work for the President's Council of Economic Advisors, which is really like a built-in economic think tank for the president. And there I worked on competitiveness policy, workforce sharing, a big higher education initiative, issues around energy and fuel prices and gas prices. And then, to kind of bring it all full circle, I'm happy to take questions. I was itching for a way to kind of get home because the way I had kind of come up in politics and my exposure to politics had really been from organizing in a community level. And my feeling was, to borrow a line that the president himself has always said, which is, he used to always say, change doesn't come from Washington, change comes to Washington. And the way change happens is not from the top down, but from the community and from the grassroots up. And I felt that actually myself, even in Washington, working in the White House 40 feet from the front door of the Oval Office. You do see the world go by, and it's certainly a thrilling experience, but you do also get an appreciation for actually how limited it can be unless you've got robust community engagement and you've got organic and enthusiastic support on a grassroots level. So I was eager to re-engage with my community. I wanted to get a little bit more sort of exposure and experience to the sort of meat of policy. So I came back to Massachusetts, went to law school, and I was in my third year last semester, about to wrap up at Harvard Law School. I had kind of, a great offer at a law firm in Boston I'd literally be making, I think, 3 times what my salary is right now. Was all ready to do that, ready to go to take that path. But, I had always been itching for a way to re-engage. And it turned out that the longtime state senator for my community was retiring. And a few of the people actually who I had worked with on that override campaign, including some of the teachers I had worked with, started reaching out, are you interested in it? And there was literally every reason in the world not to do it. I don't know if there's people, if any of you are interested in ever running for office yourself, but there will never be a time when it looks like it's realistic or easy or even something that's not completely reckless.
Right.
Yeah, there'll never be a convenient time. That's just not how it works, unless you're Jeb Bush or something.
There are lots of reasons to say no.
Right, there's always a million reasons to say no. I had a 6-month-old baby. I hadn't taken the bar yet. I was still in school. I had this job, this kind of easier, more lucrative job lined up. Ready to go. But decided to jump in. And test it out, and won my first election, the primary, by 192 votes, 5-way election. I'm now the youngest member of the Massachusetts Senate, and I do think we get to engage in a really substantive, meaningful way on issues that are critical to our generation. We have legislation now on ride sharing. I don't know if people have been following about Uber and Airbnb and all these other issues that I think are very relevant to our generation, the cost of college.
The sharing economy, you're saying?
Yeah, the sharing economy.
You mean regulating the sharing economy.
Exactly, and actually we have a voice and we have a perspective on some of those issues that frankly I think a lot of people in legislatures, not just in Massachusetts, but all over the country just don't know. I mean, one funny anecdote, I'm on the committee that's looking at this Uber legislation, and we had a marathon hearing 2 months ago or so, and judging by the questions some of my colleagues were asking, I'm almost completely certain that I might be the only member of the committee that actually uses Uber.
And do you want, and this is the thing, do you want people making laws for you that don't know about it, that don't have an experience, and then also that are older so that the laws will be set in place but may not affect them as much as it affects others? That's kind of the other thing to think about.
So, it's really fun work, it's stimulating work, it's certainly not easy. Being an elected official is hard. You've got, I like to say I have 160,000 bosses, but you also get to steer your own ship and design your own priorities and focus on and make a difference on the things that you're really passionate about. So some of the things we've been working on, quite a lot of work around substance abuse, combating the opiate addiction crisis. We're doing a lot of work around college costs and skills training. I'm working on a big long-term initiative for East-West Rail between Springfield and Boston.
Well,
so
there's another speaker. His name is Governor DeCosta.
Yeah.
Loves rail. I was going to say.
We work with him a lot.
You've got a great ally.
Yeah, no, he's the best. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. Happy to touch back to Dan or take questions or elaborate on other things if people have other questions.
Okay, let me open up at first because I have some,
Yeah.
but I'll save them. Any questions for Eric in the crowd? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
And actually, introduce yourself. Tell them your
where
major and
you're from.
Elder Sanchez. I'm manager major. I'm in an LPP class with Professor Ehrman from upstate New York. But it's like upstate New York, like how Newton is supposedly Western Massachusetts.
Right.
Yeah, I'm like an hour from New York City, but that's not upstate. But I was
Where
wondering,
in?
Orange and Ulster.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know the area a little bit.
Oh, okay. Newburgh.
Yep.
Yeah. Murder capital of New York.
Great.
So when you first started volunteering with the Obama campaign at that point, did you envision that as being something when you graduated you were going to continue with, or was that just something you wanted to get involved with and see where it went, or did it just happen to fall in the right place at the right time?
Great question. So like a lot of college seniors, I was had a lot of various things I was interested in and trying to explore. I mean, I was definitely very interested in politics and I thought about doing stuff in politics, I thought about going straight to grad school, I thought about, maybe doing something in nonprofits. But I knew I probably, if I could, wanted to, after the more I learned about Obama, the more I read about him, and the more I kind of got exposed to him, the more I wanted to just work for him and work on his campaign. So pretty soon, I'd say beginning of senior year, I was a little more unsure. Middle of senior year, I was like very strongly kind of excited about the idea of working on a presidential campaign. By the sort of spring of senior year, I was like,
all in.
Yeah, all in. And you really have to have that approach because...
That was my next thing, was believing, because the hours and the pay are not why you do it.
Right. My advice, if you're interested in politics, there's no better exposure, especially when you're young and getting on a campaign. Campaigns are, they're a little bit like working for startups. They're more egalitarian, they're flatter in their structure than, maybe a government role or something like that. You're basically, the way campaigns are set up is if you're willing to do the work, they're going to give you the work, and if you're able to do the work,
you get more.
They're going to get, and so you just finish the task in front of you, and they give you more. And so as a result, I had people. There were people in our campaign office in New Hampshire, in Manchester, New Hampshire, who, there was a guy who used to come in like literally every day, who was in his 40s, who was like a retired, or he had taken a buyout. And retired early from a GM plant in Michigan, and liked what he had heard about Obama, and literally got in his car and drove to New Hampshire and was crashing on the couch of a supporter who had basically opened up their living room to volunteers. By the end of it, this guy was helping run our entire data operation for the primary, and was like directing about 15 other people. The night before the primary. So. Campaigns are just great exposure, and I would say, because you guys are a group of students who are kind of interested in this stuff as you build your career, if you look at people who are really actually driving change and are actually making things happen in the public sphere, and Tim can probably chime in on this too because he works in this area, but they basically all have three things in common. I call them the 3 Ps: policy, politics, and press. You have got to master the policy, and you have to understand it on a deep and fundamental level, and if you don't understand and master the policy, you are going to hit a ceiling very fast.
I would say that you could look at the GOP field now.
Right.
That at this point, it doesn't matter as much that Carson and Trump don't know it.
Right.
But
eventually...
right, Tim, you could weigh in, but I think that's going to have consequences.
And the Rick Perry oops, comment
3
last
agencies
time,
you get rid of.
But even on a staff level, that's why you guys are all students. You're all in school. Use this time to really understand the policy. Learn study your economics courses. Like, it does make a difference. So that's the first piece, policy. The second, and then the other thing because of that is there's a lot of strategy that goes into policy work, and you can't do that second, third, fourth order thinking about the policies if you don't have fluency in all the underlying concepts.
And I'm going to jump in because so many of the students are taking a course where we're talking about that. For the intro to law students in the room, today we explored Lawrence and the road to Windsor, and then ultimately Obergefell. I would say that President Obama absolutely was thinking 3-4 moves down on his policy toward same-sex marriage.
Yeah,
do you agree? So Obama saw that incrementalism was ultimately the way to go, that smaller steps,
especially when dealing with civil rights issues.
Completely agreed. That the lesson that he takes is that change comes from changing people's minds and culture, not imposed.
Right.
Right. So that's a good example.
And often the examples of sort of legally imposed change, you know, you often see a lot of backfires because there's not significant enough sort of social change that goes along with it. So policy is the first piece. Second is politics, and what I mean, obviously it's all politics, but I mean by that is the small p politics, the coalition building, the consensus building, knowing who to talk to, knowing which group gets brought in, knowing how to build and organize a coalition.
You are a great student of Governor Dukakis.
Yeah,
He says the same thing.
Exactly.
I mean,
Because honestly, if you master the politics without understanding the policy, you're organizing for no reason. If you understand the policy without a sort of roadmap for how to master the politics, then you're an academic. I mean, it's academic. It's not in the arena.
In the most pejorative.
Right? No, I'm kidding.
I'm kidding. Yeah.
But there's a role for pie in the sky kind of theorizing, and then it's very different if you want to actualize it.
Right.
And then the final piece, you know, after policy and politics is the press. This is the third P. And you can have the greatest political strategy and the greatest political instincts and have all the coalitions and groups behind you and all the different interests aligned. Mm-hmm. You can have the best policy that's the most thought out and the most sort of thoughtful and serious. If you can't communicate it to the public, and if you can't explain it to people, and if you can't get it through the filters that are ultimately what transmit information to the public, which is the media, and increasingly social media and internet, which is part of the equation.
I'm going to refer to one of our greatest social philosophers, Chris Rock, right? He has a great line about this, and I want to see what you think. So he basically said that President Bush 43 was the first cable TV on-demand president, where he could reach out to those who agreed with him and that would basically watch his channel. And Obama has to work in a world where there's some people who will watch his channel and some who will watch another channel that rhymes with Knox Foos, right? So you know, the Fox effect, but essentially where it's harder for him to reach those who don't agree with him. So that's part of the challenge, that we're so segmented in our own echo chambers. Right. Tell me about, you know, witnessing that and the sort of the change from the big three networks, which is if you used to want to reach people, you would do Today's Show and the evening news, and then people have credited President Obama with sort of going directly to the people. Right. I think his Biden announcement for VP was text
message.
Right. So I mean, he employed a lot of new strategies.
So exactly. So the third P is press, and really communications, and that's just an essentialist. And if you look at the people, you know, just to wrap it up, if you look at the people who are the most effective, they master all three: the press, the politics, the policy, and they can jump in and out of each bucket, you know, almost without even appreciating it or knowing. You mean Michael Dukakis is a good example. He can explain issues in clear and succinct ways. That's the press piece. He knows who the key players are, and he has an ability to bring people in, to share credit, to build coalitions, and he obviously has a deep and fundamental understanding of the underlying policy. So yeah, I mean, to talk about Dan's piece, I mean, one of the biggest sort of social changes obviously happening, not just in politics, but in our kind of broader culture and in our broader society, is the sort of transformation of media. And, you know, it used to be when Ronald Reagan needed to communicate something to the American people, they would call a press conference, and if ABC, NBC, and CBS interrupted their local, you know, we interrupt this program to bring you, you know, an address from the White House, 50 million people would watch it. And basically anyone who had their TV set on at 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night when he was getting up to give the press conference would get the information. Right. And it was delivered by a trusted medium that people kind of inherently had faith in, because you had these figures like Walter Cronkite or Lister or Edward Murrow or others who had such gravitas and really reverence on the part of the American people that those messages could relatively easily be transmitted. It was also very top-down in the sense that if the three network executives didn't want to have a press conference on something, they weren't going to have a press conference on that, and nobody was going to learn. But if they did decide to do it, and they did decide to have that press conference, you could have a fair amount of confidence that everybody in the country was going to watch it. You fast forward 25 years or so, President Obama has a press conference. ABC, NBC, CBS still cover it. CNN will probably cover it. Fox News begrudgingly will cover it. MSNBC will cover it.
With something scrolling
Right.
on the bottom.
But so what? You know, so six TV stations out of 100 that people watch is going to cover it, and as soon as the press conferences turns on, everybody who's not interested already is going to immediately change the channel to one of the 95 other channels that isn't covering it,
Or go on
Netflix, or go on in demand, or just not watch TV at all and instead, I don't know, go on their phone or go do whatever. And so what you've ended up having is a tremendous disaggregation of media, and that contributes to the polarization, and it contributes to the echo chamber, because again, the only people still watching are the people that already have opinions and are already engaged. You're losing the casual observers when you have who stumble upon the news conference because they thought they were going to be watching, you know, Houston, Dallas, or whatever one of those old shows was, and they can't change, literally can't, every other channel has the press conference on. You know, so the question then becomes is, how do you push a narrative, how do you cut through that, and deliver content and actually move the needle, again, move public opinion, in a media environment that's so disaggregated.
The healthcare, to me, as an observer, you were,
Yeah.
you know, maybe it's like asking the chicken about, you know, chicken a la king. You know, you were right in there, but watching that, it was just amazing because it was so hard to have a consistent message in the run-up to the Affordable Care Act, and, you know, pulling the plug on grandma, death panels, and it was so hard to push back. Right. I mean, so I thought that was an example of how hard it is to get your message across.
So some of it is, it's why it's so important to have a president like Obama, who, I mean, for lack of a better term, is just so cool and able to, you know, and is so comfortable enough with himself to be able to kind of be put in different venues. But, you know, that's why they've made a very deliberate strategy going back to even that 2008 campaign to use social media, which is really a very profound change. When you think about the history of political communication, because it's the candidate speaking directly to the consumer without any middleman. It used to be that, you know, Reagan would have 50 million people watch his press conference, but it was dependent on CBS and NBC and ABC carrying the press conference. Now Obama puts a Vine up, or puts a tweet out, or a Facebook.
Now he has his own Facebook account.
Yeah, and it's there's no intermediary. He's communicating directly to the person receiving the content, and that's a pretty fundamental change in how political communication works. The thing is, though, is you have to recognize that still has limitations, because I think the White House, Obama's sort of there's a new Twitter handle that has about 4 million people on it, but the sort of Barack Obama Twitter handle, I think, has 30 or 40 million people on it, which is a lot of people, but there's 300 million people in the country, and all 40 million people don't see every tweet. So you can quickly get, you know, delude yourself into thinking that you're having the same level of engagement when you're not necessarily, and generally the people who are following and liking the page are kind of people who are already super engaged.
You don't need to win them over sometimes,
to begin with. So what does he do? He does a lot of non-traditional media now. You know, the days of sort of sitting down with the network news anchor and having a sort of sit-down interview to communicate your message are really a thing of the past.
Totally.
I don't know, people saw, like, he did this thing, the Zach Galifianakis.
Anyone see that? Between two firms? And that was to make sure people, it was also enrolling.
Exactly, a younger audience.
And make sure you get healthcare coverage, because the Affordable Care Act provided subsidies.
He does, you know, he goes on a lot of podcasts that aren't necessarily known to the general public, but that have millions of, actually some of them have millions of people. Yeah, Mark Maron, exactly, have millions of people listening to them. He's done a lot of, like, direct videos. But, that also takes quite a lot more time than the old model, because in order to communicate with the same number of people, you have to use so many different mediums.
Yeah.
And, we don't really know what the impact of that is going to be on our democracy.
I would say that Trump's ability to directly tweet and go on Facebook is one reason that people like him.
Right.
So maybe that's an argument for having a filter. I think in a previous era where the mass media...
It would never have been taken seriously.
Agreed. So that, it's a knife that cuts two ways.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, media is more democratized, people have more access. Someone who wants to can literally find out, everything. About every issue. Everything is kind of accessible.
And everyone can sort of be a celebrity. You think about,
Right.
YouTube videos and other things, right?
The flip side to that is it increases polarization, because people are only clicking on the stuff that already, all the research shows people generally are just consuming content that already affirms their viewpoint rather than challenging their viewpoint. So it's easy then for somebody who thinks Obama is a Kenyan socialist to think that that's a totally mainstream opinion, because all their Facebook friends and all the
an
media,
article that they post,
that they consume are agreeing with them. Whereas in a different era, that kind of a thing would have been filtered out by a newspaper editor or by a network news executive or something like that.
That's great. Great point.
Any other questions?
Any other?
Going off that.
You want to introduce yourself? Where are you
Oh
from?
yeah. I'm Brandon. I'm from New Hampshire.
All right. We're in New Hampshire.
Just north of Portsmouth in Rochester.
Yep. Yeah, I know. Been there multiple times.
Yeah.
He knocked on your door and he stayed with your family for a few years.
That's who that guy was. So I was just wondering. I've heard bits here and there about how Obama, talking about the technology he uses, kind of also used data and some more advanced analytics than other candidates have. And I think he even had help of Larry Page and Google on that, if I'm not mistaken.
Eric Schmidt. Yeah.
Eric Schmidt.
Especially
Okay.
2012.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you have kind of seen the effects of that, or if you have any thoughts on it regarding the campaign, or how he uses that in reaching his audience with so many different mediums to
Yeah.
connect
And then
with.
maybe what effect could that have on future?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe too, if you think that other presidents in the future will continue with that, or if it's something kind of unique to him.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes. That was a huge part of his strategy, both in 2008 and in 2012, and it's already trickled down and has kind of permeated and changed politics. I borrowed very heavily from his sort of data strategies on my own race for state senate. And the short sort of crib notes version of this is there's sort of two theories of how to do political organizing. One is a kind of get out the vote strategy, which is basically bringing in new people who aren't regular voters, but who fit a kind of demographic and sort of cultural bucket of people who are very likely to vote for you, and getting those people to vote in higher numbers. So
In 2008, the youth vote.
right, the youth, yeah, that's a great example. Like college campuses, people under 30 vote at pretty low numbers. They tended to vote more Democratic, so it helps Democrats if the portion of people under 30 voting goes from 20% to 25%. Like that actually represents hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of new voters.
Right.
And if they're breaking for that candidate 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, that's going to help a tremendous amount. That type of organizing is incredibly expensive and very time consuming, and really has only been shown to be effective, and this is kind of controversial, but has only really been shown to be very effective consistently on presidential elections or other very, very, very high stakes elections, because if you think about it, you're changing somebody's behavior pattern, and getting somebody to change their behavior pattern is hard. So someone who doesn't vote might change their behavior and go vote to help elect a new president because the stakes are so high. But they might not do that for a new school committee member or a new mayor. And if you think about it, it actually should be the opposite.
In terms of impact on your daily life, right?
Not only because the local officials have significantly more impact on your day-to-day life, you know, your trash pickup and your kids' school and your roads and your snow. Anybody who lived through last year's winter in Boston can appreciate that. But the other portion of it is you're proportionally more of the vote in a smaller election. You know, so if you're voting in an election of 100 million people, that's one thing. If you're voting in an election of 100,000 or 10,000 or 1,000. Yeah. But that's a longer conversation. But so that's one theory. The other is what's called persuasion, and that's taking a kind of already existing universe of people who you know are going to be showing up in the voting booth and persuading them to vote one way or the other. And you have to, an effective campaign has to do both. It has to both bring out new people who are kind of likely to vote for you, and also work on changing the minds of the undecided voters. And that's Obama's entire data operation is meant to feed into that central strategy. And the purpose of the data is to be able to identify with some level of sophistication and accuracy who the persuadable voters are and who the voters are who need to get touched and reminded to vote. So,
and there's some new behavioral economics, like a lot of reminding people now. You know, when you get your power bill and it says what your neighbors used compared to your own, they've sort of done that with voting.
Yeah, exactly. Very effective.
If your neighbors voted, it makes you feel a civic obligation. So it's really interesting techniques that are sort of based in social psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
that have been effectively employed.
But all of the fancy stuff aside, it still remains that the single biggest predictor of whether or not someone is going to vote is whether they voted before.
Last time.
And so, you kind of start with a universe of like, okay, all people. Then, obviously you have to be over 18 and you have to be a U.S. citizen. So that narrows it. And then you say, okay, people you have to be registered. Now we're changing, those rules are changing in states with same-day registration, but generally speaking...
One party likes to make it easier for people to register, and the other seems to try to make it hard. I mean, come on.
So you start, so then you narrow it a little more by who's registered, and then you can look up voter history and say, okay, if they voted once in the last 10 years, once in the last 4 years, they only vote in presidential elections.
That's expensive to get that data, right? It costs a lot to... So a lot of people are making money in that world, like the database world.
So that's a short answer. And so exactly, so the data is really meant to inform and better tailor the resources, the contact resources. Because once you have that universe of people identified through data, then you have to actually start touching them, communicating with them. And so maybe they see a TV ad, maybe they get a thing in the mail, maybe someone calls them, maybe someone knocks on their door.
Facebook feed?
Right, maybe it shows up in their Facebook feed. So there's, like, if you think about it, there's infinite ways that someone can get information. A friend tells them, they hear it on the radio, they see a billboard, they see a whatever. And so then the next strategy has to be, well, what are the most effective ways to cut through the noise and actually then move that person to either change their behavior and go vote, or move them to persuade them to vote for you or to vote for that specific candidate. And the research basically shows the most effective way is for a friend of theirs to suggest it to them. And that requires an immense amount of organizing, because you have to basically put a campaign together where people go into their neighborhoods and go talk to their neighbors and convince them, to vote. And then so you start to build the campaign off of that. But the data is meant to give you that list, to give you that targeted set of voters that you then
who to go after.
You go after with your communications.
That's funny, right? We have all this technology yet. Governor Cox does the same thing, which is precinct block captains and I'm sure you talked about
absolutely. That. And part of the takeaway from the Obama campaign is you can't win an election by just like buying Facebook ads, and you have to marry up a smart data-informed strategy with a very sort of nuanced communication strategy, and you have to have organic energy to make it all happen. And so, you guys are equipped with some of these skills now. You can look at the current people running for president, look at their operations, look at the sophistication of their teams, look at the sort of elements of their message, and you can kind of almost predict, who's going to continue to move forward, and who's going to be a kind of flash in the pan. And these are the elements that you look at.
Hi, my name's Riley. I'm from Rhode Island. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience. Oh, sorry, I'm a student of Governor Dukakis's.
Nice.
Yeah.
Make sure you
tell him I said hi.
Yeah, we'll do. He's talked about you before, actually. I guess I was wondering, I think it's a testament to our democracy that, Governor Dukakis is very close to the White House, and now, students have interactions with him. What was it like for you traveling around with then Senator Obama? And obviously the Senate is a very honorable position, but going to the White House is a whole another level. What was it like seeing the personal transition between President Obama going from a U.S. Senator who was a dark horse candidate for president and 2 years prior was an Illinois state senator to going to being the leader of the free world?
Yeah, I mean, it was wild. It happened bit by bit. It started with driving them around in a minivan.
From Avis to Air Force One. Is that going to be your memoir?
Well, I'll give you one story, actually, one anecdote related to that sums it up, and then I have to catch a plane, unfortunately, but I can come back.
Yeah.
When I was in New Hampshire, working in the New Hampshire primary, it was around this time of year in the cycle, it was like winter of 2007, 2008. I went and I was in Portsmouth, and I went to meet with the principal at Portsmouth High School because we wanted to have an event where Obama was going to go speak at the high school in Portsmouth. So I, called the principal's office, made like an appointment, and I go in, meet with him, and I introduced myself. I'm like 22, like right out of college. He must have just been laughing about the whole thing, but I was like, I was in my little suit and like all kind of prepared, and I said, I forget what his name was, but Mr. So-and-so, my name is Eric Lesser. I'm representing the Obama campaign. I wanted to reach out because the senator is interested in doing a visit to your high school, and would we be able to use the gym for a town hall? And he was like, he's like, who is it again? I was like, he's Barack Obama. He's like running for president. He's a U.S. senator from Illinois. He's like, okay. He's like, well, let me check. And he pulls out a paper calendar, not looking on.
Great.
And he's leafing through the paper calendar, and he's like, what were the dates? And it's like, I was like, no, it's this day that he's able to come, like at this time, can we reserve the gym for this day? And he looks and he goes, oh, I'm really sorry. He's like, I don't think that's going to be possible. And I was sort of like, they train us to be so polite, and I'm like sort of like sitting there, and I'm like,
You wanted to know what's
yeah.
blocking
I was like,
you.
well, is there anything that's movable, or what's the conflict? He says, oh, well, we have the gym is occupied for a JV girls basketball practice, not a game, practice.
Great.
He goes, I'm sorry, we can't move it. And I was like, I'm like sort of thinking in my head, I'm like, how am I supposed to handle this? And I was like, oh, well, the senator is like a big basketball fan.
Nice.
Like he could meet the team. He could sign some balls. Like he could take a picture with the team beforehand. Or he's a really big basketball fan. He's a big Bulls fan. And I was like, okay. And I thought that was good. I was like, okay, well, he'll cave. And then he was like, he's like, I'm sorry, I don't think it's gonna work. And I was like, okay. So I immediately leave and I call my boss. Her name is Alyssa Mastromonaco, who ended up becoming the deputy White House chief of staff, and now actually is the COO of Vice Media in New York. She was probably about 29 or 30.
Very old.
Yeah. I thought she was old. Yeah, how old I am now. But so I called her and I was like, Alyssa, I don't know what to do. Like this principal is saying that like we can't go, and she goes, don't worry about it. Like we'll find another place. Like it's not worth creating an issue. So I was like, okay. Fast forward to summer of 2009, president's in the middle of the healthcare debate, and this was when the Tea Party first started, and I don't know if people followed, but the big story of how the Tea Party first started is they were confronting people at all these town hall meetings. So like they shouted at our inspector at this town hall meeting. He did in Pennsylvania, and Barney Frank, and so this was all over cable news. So my boss actually was like, we got to get the president out to a town hall. He has to show that he's not afraid of it and he's still engaging. Got to get him to a town hall. So they're like, okay, well, it he's got a lot on his plate, the president, so he can't like be away that long. So it's got to be somewhere relatively close. So Virginia and Maryland were ruled out because they were kind of blue states, and he needed to be a state that was like a little bit more in between, and actually most of the states close to DC are it couldn't be somewhere like South Carolina that would just be too extreme. So they're like, well, how about New Hampshire? Like New Hampshire is sort of a swing state and it's pretty close. Okay, so imagine this when I see on the schedule that the place where they booked was the high school in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the exact same high school that had said no a year and a half earlier. So Alyssa, who's now the White House scheduler, I emailed her and I was like, you will not believe this. Like, I just looked at the schedule and the high school is the exact same high school where we went. Like, it's the same principal. And she was like, that's too good to be true. So they put me on Air Force One with them. And sent me up for the day to go with Obama up to the town hall in New Hampshire. We flew in on Marine One. We landed. They put me right in the motorcade. The whole highway is shut down. Like everything is all locked off. And this is a little bit about the camaraderie of the team. Like we were having some fun with this. So they took the principal, and of course he's standing right at the front of the school, ready to greet the president. Yeah. So the president jumps out, walks over, shakes his hand, says hello, walks in. About 25 steps behind him, I'm scurrying up, and the principal was about to turn to walk back into the school, and I went and I started waving to him. I was like, "Hey, remember me? Like I'm Eric Lester, the guy you met with." And to his credit, he goes, "Oh, I'm really, really sorry. We really should have had him come last
time." It's easy to be gracious when you fly in on Marine One, Air Force One. That is great.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of an example of the change.
Thank you.
That's great. Tim, you want to do a quick question, and then we'll wrap it up?
I just wondered if you might want to talk a little bit about Hillary Clinton's campaign and how different it is, or whether it is different
now versus then. Yeah,
because you saw it firsthand.
So I'm a supporter of Hillary's. I think she would be a great president. My feeling on the 08 campaign was never that it was anti-Hillary. It was pro Obama, and for a variety of reasons, I obviously thought he was sort of the better person for that time and place and situation in 2008. I think that she's in a much more dominant place certainly now than even in 08, and she was in a dominant position certainly in 2006, 2007. But I think that her record as Secretary of State, the achievements she had as Secretary of State sort of add even more to the argument.
Well, I would say two things in 08. So, historic once-in-a-generation candidate. Iraq War is a bit fresher.
Right.
I think those two things in 08 played a big role.
There's no doubt. It's kind of easy for people to forget, and the economy really started to dominate the 08 race in the general election. But this was in the middle of the sort of disintegration of the entire Iraq War was really happening in 07, 08. Petraeus' surge was going on. There was a vote in Congress on the surge that was very controversial, and a lot of the energy that was fueling Obama's early sort of oxygen, in 2007 was directly tied to his consistent opposition to the war in Iraq.
We can tie in the media. Someone videotaped him at an
when he was a state
Iraq
senator.
War rally in 02.
Right.
So that helped. It was on the record.
Exactly. And there was a record of it. And and Hillary didn't never apologize for the Iraq War vote and was sort of in a box on that. So that's not here anymore. But I think the main thing is I also think the other piece of it is that I actually think when the dust settles a little bit, Obama's going to be leaving on a very high note. And I think that he's going to be leaving actually as a pretty popular president. His numbers are already starting to go back up. And I think that that's going to continue, especially as the economy continues to improve and the sort of fever breaks on kind of attacking him endlessly. And so that's a very different dynamic than the '08 election, where everyone was desperate for a change from Bush. And I think ultimately, if people want a sort of continuation of the general direction Obama has brought the country, that bodes well for Hillary. And if people are desperate for a change of direction, frankly, no matter who the Democratic nominee is, they're going to have a tough time. But Hillary in particular, as a member of his cabinet and as a Secretary of State, will have a hard time. So, I think that I think she's in a very strong position. I also think that when you just kind of look at the issues, when you go issue by issue, she's just in a better place than the Republicans are. Immigration, healthcare, civil rights, everything. I mean, it's hard to see a Republican coming out of this type of a primary without making the sort of Faustian bargain that they need to make to win the primary. To come out of it in a position that puts them, makes them well suited to win a general election. Right. What state will the eventual Republican nominee win that Obama won in 2012? I think the only person who could plausibly do it is maybe Rubio, but he's made quite a lot of very extreme statements and positions, and has a pretty extreme record. He only looks moderate compared to like Donald Trump, basically, and Ben Carson, but
he was elected. Tea Party support, Rubio. Yeah.
Right. So a good example, Mitt Romney. If the Mitt Romney we all knew in Massachusetts in the first 2 years of his governorship, that passed Romney Care and governed as a really kind of moderate, sort of center right, kind of like a Charlie Baker style Republican, that Mitt Romney would have won a general election. But in order to win his party's primary,
self-deportation.
Right, he took very extreme, out of the mainstream positions. Same with John McCain. John McCain had like a very, John McCain had a reputation as a kind of maverick and as a moderate. He partnered with Marty Meehan on campaign finance reform. He worked on, he supported closing Guantanamo, was against torture. But again, in order to win his primary,
he speaks at Liberty University.
Right. He makes some. The John McCain of 2000 probably would. He might not have won given where the country was in '08, but it would have been much closer. But you can't get through the primary. And this kind of, to close it all up, this ties back to the discussion about media. What's driving a lot of this polarization is the media change, and the result is it distorts who our nominees are. And so you end up with it, and it perpetuates even more polarization because you end up with two people who are here instead of two people who are here. And it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. And then generally the people who are out here are only listening to media that's out here. And then the people in the middle become disaffected because they feel like no candidate is speaking to them. And so it's, eventually it'll crack and we'll figure out, it'll correct itself. But for now it's a period of quite a lot of instability in the political process.
Well, until then, keep doing what you're doing, and hopefully you can solve this.
That was a mouthful, I'm sorry.
It was great.
Yeah,
no, it was great. So thank you.